Thank you all so much for being here and taking part in this discussion. So let's go back 30 years ago. This very important decision was made to merge two very diverse school systems into one to form the Wake County Public School System. From your own personal perspectives, what was the overall goal of the merger?
To keep the Raleigh city schools from becoming an all-black school system.
Part of the problem was that Raleigh's school system was not coterminous with the Raleigh city limits. So Raleigh city limits were growing, and the population of Raleigh was definitely growing, but the school system boundary was fixed. And so, as Frank said, it was a matter of, I think, racial diversity that really drove the decision, although there were lots of other discussion points, and there's a lot of logic in having a countywide system, but that was probably the key issue.
Overall resources for all the kids in Wake County was the global sort of goal, I think.
Yeah. Let me say this, that I think that the real purpose of merger was to improve the educational opportunities for boys and girls, and I think that has been accomplished in the 30 years.
Above everything else, there was a desire to raise the level of education, because education is such an important thing to the economy, to the quality of life, and to the living about everybody in the area.
So what were the key arguments for the merger?
In that time, the race was really an issue. You can't skirt the fact that the Raleigh city school system was becoming more heavily minority. And there were people then who were moving out of Raleigh so that they would not have to be a part of a school system that was growing predominantly black.
So what about the arguments against the merger? What were those key arguments?
Neighborhood schools were very concerned about losing their identity as a neighborhood school.
It was a turf war, no doubt about it.
In the black community, you had a large segment in the black community that didn't want merger.
Absolutely.
Because they were going to lose control of the schools.
A lot of the frustrations never came to surface because there were people in the neighborhood who worked diligently to see that some of the things that were being talked about never came to fruition. We never lost one day, not one school day, because of disruption in schools as a result of all of this, and that was not easy. I'm telling you, it took a lot of work to make that happen.
Does 30 years ago seem like a long time, or does it seem like it just happened yesterday?
Yesterday.
Your memories of this are extremely sharp. Tell me about the process then to get the merger to happen and implement it.
There was a referendum, and the referendum was soundly defeated, both in the county and in the city.
About 3-1.
And it was
2-1.
So when that happened, that put it all in limbo. That eliminated merger for the time being.
That was enabling legislation that permitted them to vote, but no binding. The vote was not a binding thing. The two boards had to agree on it under the law.
So they went against the wishes of the voters.
Well, years later, things material.
No, not that many years later.
Well, it was
2 years later.
2 years later.
yeah, 2 years later.
But that was the courageous aspect of it, because the legislature didn't have to rely on the referendum, and it was a very courageous decision to move ahead despite that vote.
It was heavy lobbying by the business community.
Absolutely.
That, major segment of the taxpayers that encouraged the county commissioners, the Raleigh and the city boards and the Wake delegation to take this action. They went to the Board of Education and got approval for the merger without a vote of the people. It's one example when the old saying, the voice of the people is the voice of finality. This is one case when that was not true. It did take some courage for those people to do that. And incidentally, all of them were threatened that if they supported the merger, they would be defeated in the forthcoming election. Would you believe that not a single one was defeated? All were reelected.
I was convinced that if we did not merge the two systems, that Raleigh would become essentially a major minority controlled system and would get starved for resources. I didn't think the county commissioners would fund it. I didn't think that the city had enough political power at that time to be able to do that, and that if we didn't have merger, we would have totally unequal school systems.
There was 5 groups that had to approve it, the 2 boards and the commissioners, the state Board of Education and the legislature. And if the legislature had gone, it wouldn't have been merged at that time. And there was 2 Raleigh votes would not have been there to pass merger.
I know it was a terrifically hard work and a difficult decision, but I think it represents really leadership at its finest. The leaders in the community not liking the direction they see the community headed, believing as a community we can do better and we can make some hard decisions now that will benefit our community in the future, and clearly that's how it played out.
We were spading new ground. There was no roadmap for where we were headed.
The leadership in the school district that was brought in and the people who had been in both districts were very courageous and very insightful. I remember principals were brought together and we were given our expectation in pretty clear terms that we would be strong instructional leaders and that we would work together.
It didn't take the administrators, once we merged, long to realize that there was a huge challenge of bringing these 2 systems together and making one system.
When you look back at what has happened in other places, it's almost miraculous that it occurred and has been so successful and has, you know, served us well for these 30 years.
I think the greatest fear was change.
Oh, yeah.
And that's still with us today.
In every respect.
Over the years that we studied merger and were trying to put it together, at times the county system was against merger, at other times the city system was against merger, and the county commissioners financed both systems. And we just saw the inequities that were there, and they were getting larger and larger every year. We had empty school buildings in the city system, and we had children running out our ears in the county system, and they all belonged to the county, but we couldn't utilize the system.
Part of the fear too, I think, that JT's talking about, was the fear on the part of the county people that they were going to be bused into inner neighborhoods.
That is correct.
And that they were going to be going to what was traditionally a black school, and therefore folks were unalterably opposed to it. And you couldn't reason. There was no reasoning. It just something had to be done.
We merged the schools, the 2 school systems very effectively in that 3-year period of time, but the thing that didn't get done was the utilizing of the buildings and the facilities downtown.
Correct.
And the integrating racially of the system. That commenced to occur in the 4th year after merger.
That's probably why it was so successful, Bob, is that wasn't pushed too quickly.
Yeah.
And that's why it wasn't pushed.
And the infrastructure got put in place first.
Right. Policy and practice, different in the 2 systems, was where the energy was exerted in those first 2 or 3 years.
Tell me again your greatest hopes of the merger.
The saying, I think I got it right, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. I mean, we have one of the top school systems in the United States. So that speaks for
you live
well
that
for
hope.
And we've done it with a commitment to equity. You know, I mean, that commitment has endured.
So is the national recognition that the Wake County Public School System has received due to, in part, the merger from 30 years ago and the efforts of all the folks?
No doubt.
I think without
Absolute
question.
No doubt that we could not be where we are today. We're getting the good things that happen as a result of the decisions that were made 30 years ago, and had they not made it, it wouldn't be the same.
Keep in mind, this didn't all happen 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. It's predicated on work that was done 30 years ago by people who were courageous enough to stand up and do what they thought was better for our community.
And I think we have to say leaders who have continued to be courageous.
What about the emotional side of what went into this decision?
The hardest thing was to be against neighborhood schools.
That's right.
Yeah.
Everybody,
Yeah.
that's like motherhood and apple pie. And you had to be against neighborhood schools in order to make it work. And that was the hardest thing for people to accept and for politicians and government leaders to deal with. How do you say, no, we can't have neighborhood schools?
I found out doing merger that once a person makes up their mind emotionally, facts will have nothing to do with changing it. And that's the reason we merged the school system after the people voted 2-1 not to merge them. It was an emotional issue more than it was a factual issue, the reason they voted that way.
There were people who were vehemently opposed to merger, vehemently opposed. But once they made up their minds that this is where we ought to go, they worked more diligently to make it work than some of those who had been on the front end of saying it should be done. It was amazing to see that evolution in mind and emotion, to see those people come forward.
I think there was an awareness that was helped by the merger, that the welfare of any one citizen in Wake County was no better or worse than the welfare of others. There was a greater spirit of unity. Also, there was a realization that Wake County was becoming one large metropolitan area.
There's no area of the county that is preferred. Holly Springs, Knightdale, Wendell, Fuquay, all of the outlying areas. People just soon live in Zebulon as in Raleigh.
You can feel pretty comfortable that you could throw a dart and wherever it landed, go to the closest school, and it's a good school. It'll be just fine. And that's really unusual.
Who do you feel was a model example of courageous leadership during this decision and its implementation, and why?
A superintendent who could take these two systems and put them together was a critical call on the part of the board, the merged Board of Education. They hired John Murphy to do that. I'm convinced, having worked with him through the whole process, that there probably was not another person in the country that could have done that. And he did a first-class job of launching that and getting that year and a half, that critical year and a half done well.
From where I sit, he was one of the first educators I heard in my lifetime who would publicly say, minority kids can learn, and we're going to see that that happens. It wasn't a subtle thing with John Murphy. It was a very, very vocal thing.
Wasn't anything subtle about John Murphy. And Bob Bridges is right. Murphy was probably the perfect guy to put the systems together because he didn't care what anybody else thought.
Absolutely right.
He was strong-willed and to his credit, did a great job.
So here we are 30 years later. How would you describe the success of the merger, and are there any disappointments?
I don't believe there's any disappointments. And I think the fact that we got equalization throughout the county that says it all.
No one could convince me that there was any other event that has been more beneficial to this area than the merger of the schools.
There's no question the opportunities we have today would not be there education-wise had merger not occurred had it not occurred when it did.
I think if there is a disappointment, it is that there are people who take all of this for granted now. And they don't understand the courage, the boldness, the work, the commitment that occurred for us to be what we are today. I think that's really important for us all to keep in mind.
So now let's talk about the courageous decisions that our leaders are facing today. They're struggling, obviously, to deal with the explosive growth of our community, and now the task of supporting all of our students. So what wisdom do you want to share with them?
Same type of bold action that brought the merger about, and willingness for a lot of people to stick their neck out and stand up for what's right.
Which
For
is
all
to
kids.
educate all the children
Yep.
in the best way we possibly can, and to provide the facilities in which they can learn.
I recall the hands-on sort of attitude taken by the corporate business leaders in the community. And I know some of them are here in the room. Some of them that are doing it now are the same ones that were doing it back then.
Yep.
It's not enough to just offer resources, and that's helpful. But we need to be committed, we need to be involved. The people who influence the community in a major way need to take a personal sort of approach to this education initiative and make sure that things go and get done that need to be done.
the great education governor, Aycock, 1901 to 1905. And one of his speeches, he says, "Our future lies not in our smokestacks and in our fatted cattle, but in our bright-eyed lads and our fair-headed lasses." Our future is in the hands of those young people.
I assume Mr. Williams heard him say that. We've talked a lot about courage and being courageous, and there's a lot of courage among this group and a lot of others that was involved. But there's some real courage need to be on the part of the county commissioners now to meet the needs of this county, to properly build the facilities, to accommodate the students we have now and those we expect to have.
You just go ahead and do what needs to be done if you're convinced it's right.